All right. So, I'm going to start with a question this morning. How many of you have ever experienced the doorway effect? Anybody? Anybody know that they've experienced the doorway effect? Okay. I'll ask it in a different way then. The doorway effect. How many of you have ever experienced walking into a different room in your house and you forget why you went in there in the first place? How many people now? All right, I think it'd be all of us. Absolutely. All right, so this is something that we're all plagued with. We go into somewhere, we go into the kitchen, and we just look around and just like, what in the world am I doing? I have no idea. So that's the doorway effect. You just walk through a doorway, and for whatever reason, you just forget why you went there. You have to go back into the other rooms. Like, all right, where did I first have this thought? I'm going to go back there and try to just piece this together to figure it out what was going on. All right, so, and I say this because this is a special day where many of us, many of our young people are walking through a doorway into their next stage of life. They're taking their next step. They're on their next part of their journey. And we need to be able to talk this morning about making sure that we remember what has taken place in our lives to lead us up to this point. To not have this moment of just forgetting, why am I here? How did I get here? What brought me here? We need to talk about making sure that we can remember what has taken place, and especially talking about holding on to and remembering what God has done for us in our lives. Because, it's true that we, there's times that we don't feel particularly close to God. We don't necessarily feel His love, feel His presence. And I bring this up because, even though we're talking about graduation, moving on to the next grade, all of us are entering into some type of new stage of life. Maybe we're empty nesters for the first time. Maybe we're just going through some hard family issues. Maybe just whatever might be going on, that there's a next stage of life that's coming. There's a doorway that we're about to walk through. And we need to talk about remembering what God has done for us, the blessings that have taken place, the peace and joy that He has brought our lives. And the issue is that it's difficult. We have a hard time remembering because we get caught up in just different circumstances. Well, I think the biggest thing is that we get caught up in being busy. We're distracted, and we just forget about the blessings that God has brought into our lives. But there's also other circumstances, just like family hardships, distract us from remembering. But this isn't something that is just a plague to us. This isn't something that we struggle with all of a sudden in the year 2018. This is something that has been taking place for thousands and thousands of years. If you were to read the Old Testament straight through, you would just see time and time again that God's people, the Israelites, constantly forgot about God's blessings. And that's where we're going to be this morning. God's people have always struggled to remember what God has done for them. So we're going to talk about what that looked like specifically, and then move into what can we do about that? What things can we do to remember, to place ourselves in a position that we can hold on to what God has done for us. And so what we're going to do is we're going to jump into the story of Joseph. And for those who might not know the story and you want to wait for VBS, there is a spoiler warning. We're talking about Joseph's life there. So if you want to leave and wait for VBS, you can do that. Don't do that. All right, but Joseph is a wonderful, wonderful man. And this takes place in the second half of the book of Genesis. And so we're talking about the road to the Exodus, talking about Joseph's story. And so what takes place with Joseph's story in his life is that he was the youngest of many brothers, and he kind of had these dreams to where, and he told his family about it, that they were one day going to bow down to him, and that he was going to be placed in an authority over them. Now, how many of you are the youngest sibling? Okay, I'm the youngest sibling too, and I can only imagine that if I went up to my family and said, one day you're going to bow down to me. I'm going to be in charge of you. They would not be too happy. They would not want to hear anything like that. And so, just like we would respond, Joseph's older brothers responded much the same way, and they might have went a little bit too far with it, to the point where at first they wanted to kill him. But luckily, some cooler heads prevailed, and but they still sold him into slavery, and they sent him to Egypt. And I bring this up because we'll be talking about the Israelite and the Egyptian relationship that's taken place, but we need to talk about how it became a good relationship before we talk about how it fell apart and what took place after that. So Joseph finds himself in Egypt, and he actually finds favor with Potiphar. He was an official, he was a leader, but then some drama took place, and he was sent to prison. And so he was in prison for a while, but again, through prison, God was working in his life, and he was able to come out of prison because Pharaoh was having some bad dreams. And Joseph was able to interpret those dreams for Pharaoh to the point, and Joseph was able to tell him that there is going to be a severe famine that will strike this land. Egypt, all around the Mediterranean, there's going to be a famine that takes place. And so Pharaoh thought highly of Joseph for this, to be able to interpret this so they can do some planning. And Joseph was a big part of turning that around and saving up enough food and resources to survive this famine. And Joseph was second in command. The only person who was above him was Pharaoh. So this Israelite was in Egypt, second in command. And this was to the point where, so this was a strong relationship. Israelite and Egypt, they had a strong relationship, even to the point where Joseph's dad, Jacob, or Israel, when he passed away, Egypt and Israel, they mourned together. That's how close their relationship was when Joseph's dad passed away, that they were mourning together, that they were holding each other up and building each other up. So that's when it kind of took a turn for the worse after that. What happens is when we move from Genesis to Exodus, there's a jump about 400 years that takes place. And through that generation after generation after generation, they didn't remember what had happened. And because of Joseph's involvement in the famine, Israelites were just flooding to Egypt to take part in those resources, to have that food, to have that opportunity. So that's that relationship. So we move forward into Exodus, and the Egyptian leaders had forgotten how that started, how the Israelites got there in the first place, and how close they really were with each other. So the Egyptian leaders, the Pharaoh, was noticing that the Israelites were really outnumbering the Egyptians heavily. The 6 million men, Jewish men, so that doesn't even count the women and children. That there were a lot of Israelites in Egypt, and Pharaoh felt intimidated. He felt threatened because of that. And so what takes place is Pharaoh decides he wants to eliminate the firstborn sons of all of Israel. And multiple things take place, and this man named Moses rises up, and God lays it on his heart and sends him the mission to lead the Israelites out of Egypt back into their land, the promised land is what they called it. This doorway from Egypt back into the promised land. So what took place is there were some plagues that took place, and Pharaoh decided, even though he let the Israelites go, Pharaoh decided, you know what, I changed my mind. Let's go after them. So it reached the point that Pharaoh and his army were marching after the Egyptians, or the Israelites, and they wanted to take them down. And so that's where we're going to pick up in Exodus chapter 14, verses 10 through 16. The Egyptian army is catching up to the Israelites. So Exodus 14, verse 10. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." So they're seeing the end. In their mind, the end is near. The Egyptians have arrived. There's nothing they can do. So Moses tries to calm them down. He tries to provide some encouragement, some support. And Moses answers the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." Now that sounds like an awesome response for Moses. That sounds like something that, yeah, he's right on. Do not be afraid. God will provide. God will get you out of this. But God has a funny sense of humor. And look at his response. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on." So it's completely opposite. Moses said to stay still, but God says, no, tell them to move. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. And I can only imagine that Moses was like, oh yeah, of course, I forgot I can just part a sea. Simple. Oh, I'm so sorry, God. How could I have forgotten that? Then God's sense of humor is wonderful. But Moses, we'll pick up in verse 21, Moses does what God tells him to do. So then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. And I have to imagine, and place yourselves in the positions of the Israelites, that you see the sea literally part with a strong east wind. You see walls of water on either side of you, and you're just strolling along. You might see some fish just casually swimming by right next to you. You would think that's something that you would remember, and remember for the rest of your life to the point where you wouldn't doubt God's power ever again. However, we need to look at the road after the Exodus, after they get through the water. And we're going to pick up in Exodus chapter 15, verses 22 through 24. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" It took 3 days for them to walk through the sea, walls of water on either side, and it took 3 days for them to reach the point where they're complaining about what is taking place. They had experienced the doorway effect. They walked through the sea, and then they totally forgot what was behind them and what God had done for them because of what was going on in their lives. They were thirsty. They were hungry. And of course, we can look at it and say, it's like, I don't blame them. 3 days without water, I would be thirsty too. But again, it's reaching the point where they had just forgotten this amazing thing that God had just done for them 3 days earlier. And this is a theme that keeps taking place throughout Exodus and throughout the entire Old Testament. And just another one, Exodus 16, verses 1 through 3. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. On the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt, in the desert the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death." So again, this is probably like 40-ish days after walking through the sea, seeing this wonderful thing that God had done for them. But again, they're conditioned, they're thirsty, they're hungry, they're tired. Maybe freedom wasn't exactly what they imagined it would be. The promised land wasn't happening as soon as they thought it might take place. So grumbling and complaining takes place. And that distracts them fully from remembering what God had done for them. So like I said, we are very much the same way. It's been happening from generation to generation for thousands of years, that we just have a hard time remembering God's blessings. We get distracted. Our circumstances change. We get hungry. We get thirsty. People distract us. So what can we do as we move forward, as we're stepping into this doorway, moving into high school, graduating high school, getting into the real world? What can we do to remember what God has done for us? And I want us to consider the rear view mirror of a car. It's something we're in a car probably most days if not every single day. We sit inside a car, or we're riding in a car, a bus, a school bus, whatever it might be. So we're pretty familiar with the rearview mirror, and this is pretty cool seeing the light just flash everywhere. But I'll get distracted, I'm sorry. All right, so we're very familiar with this. And we understand that that's an important part of the car, but there's two ways in which we can use the rearview mirror improperly. That we use it in a way that it wasn't intended for. And the first of which is we're driving down the road, and all we do is look at the rearview mirror. So we don't look at the road ahead whatsoever. We are just staring into the rearview mirror. We look at absolutely nothing else. And what that does, and this is what the Israelites did, that they were constantly just looking in the rearview mirror, just looking back at Egypt and all the water that they had and all the food that they had and all the stability that took place, even though that they were slaves or were first forced to work and work and work. And Pharaoh was killing their firstborn sons. They'd forgotten that because they're so focused on here looking at what they thought was good, and they're not looking at what's ahead of them. They're not holding on to that promise that God is going to deliver them to the promised land. That's something that they have forgotten. That's something that they're not remembering. So that's the first thing, is just to stare driving into the road. And we can imagine how dangerous that would be. I don't encourage anybody to try this on your way home. Just stare into the rearview mirror and not look at all into what's ahead of you. The guardrails that are in front of you. Being able to see what's ahead of you, see what's coming. So the second part, or the second way to improperly use this, is to completely ignore it. You might as well just take it off your windshield because you're never going to use the rearview mirror. And what takes place there is that we can't look behind us. We can't know if something is creeping up towards us. Maybe it's an ambulance, maybe a police officer, maybe it's just somebody speeding down the road, and we need to get over into the next lane. But that's why it's so important to, even though we're looking at the big picture, the windshield, we're looking ahead at the road, we need to make sure that we're using this. We can't ignore it, and we can't stare at it fully. We have to find this balance. And that balance is we're looking ahead, we're seeing where we're going. The GPS is telling us where to go, where to turn, but we need to keep looking up and remembering, you know what? I was able to avoid that pothole, that really big pothole, but you can look back and see it and be like, wow, I'm so glad I didn't hit that. Or maybe it's an accident that just took place behind you, and you're like, wow, it's like, I can't believe that. Looking back, that I am safe in this situation. We need to be looking ahead, but we also need to be reminding ourselves of what has taken place in our lives. We need that reminder every single day. So for our kids going to college, hold on to our trips, whether it's CIY, Summer in the Sun, statewide. Remember how close you felt to God in those moments, whether it's in worship, just a small group discussion. Hold on to that. Remember that every single day. Whatever stage of life that we might be in, we need to constantly remind ourselves of what God has done. God has gotten us over an addiction. God has beaten cancer in our lives. God has healed relationships in our lives. Those are the things that we need to remember. Even though we're pressing forward and we're looking forward to what's to come, we're looking back and remembering these wonderful things that have taken place. That's what we got to do. But we also need to hold on to a wonderful promise that is found in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 8. Again, this is just a little bit before Moses passes away later in the Old Testament. He says, "The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged." And we'll just stay right there for a second. Because, we've talked about being on this road, this life journey. We're in a car. We understand we need to look through the windshield, but take glances back at the rearview mirror. But this is an awesome, awesome promise for us. That the Lord himself goes before you. That the God who brought the Israelites through the sea, made those walls of water, that same God is with us now, and that's the same God that goes before us, that is on the road ahead of us, that has a plan for our lives ahead of us. Remember what was behind. Remember that he's with you now. Remember that he is going to be with you. He is already down the road waiting for you, already planning out your steps, already planning out your life. And this is a wonderful verse, but there's actually a couple other verses that we're going to look at and see if you can spot some similarities in what's being said. And the first of which is found when Joseph's brothers came to him in Egypt, and Joseph finally said that I am Joseph, I am your brother. This is what Joseph told them. Genesis 45:5. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. That God is in the business of, yeah, he did some amazing things in the past. He's with you now, but he is always planning ahead. That God sent Joseph ahead of his brothers, that he could work in the famine in Egypt and in the land, that he could work through that he could gather those resources to save lives. That's how God operates. He is thinking ahead. He is working ahead. That God sent Joseph ahead. God is going ahead of us. And now we're going to look at this final one, and this is Jesus speaking to his disciples. See if it sounds familiar. Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I am going to prepare a place for you? And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you also may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going. Let's hold on to that with everything that we have. As we're on this journey, we're on the road, we have God with us, we have our family with us, we have our friends with us. Let's remember that God is the same God throughout all of history, now, and forevermore. That God is consistent. God is never changing. God is always loving. And he has a plan for what's to come. As we walk through each doorway throughout the rest of our lives, let's not forget to take a look back and say, wow, God, I can't believe you've got me here. And even in the times where we feel abandoned in the desert, like the Israelites, those are times we need to hold on even more to his promises, that he is going to deliver us, that he is ahead of us, he is already out there, he is already waiting for us to come to him. And this is going to be our time where we enter into a time of communion. And this is another thing, that communion for many of us, we've grown up in the church, we've been doing this for maybe decades. That this is a time where we just understand and we kind of get caught up in going through the motions. And we don't do it intentionally, but we just get caught up in, okay, I know I need to take the bread, I know I need to take the cup, maybe say a prayer. But this really is the time that we sit back and reflect and remember what God has specifically done for us, specifically through sending his son on the cross to die for us. To holding on to and remembering that great love that was shown, that great sacrifice that took place, and how amazing that was. And even though we don't always feel it, just remembering that it's true, remembering that it happened, even when we don't feel like it. So as we're entering into this time of communion, let's go back to what it's supposed to be, a time of remembrance, remembering what God has done for all of us and what God has done for you specifically. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for this morning again. Thank you for all the different stages of life that we're able to enjoy. And God, I know you know that some of them are very difficult. Some of them are so hard. We feel like we can't see an end. We feel like you're not there. We feel like you're not listening. We feel like you don't have a plan. But God, let us take a look back and remember that you already have done amazing things for this world and amazing things in our lives. God, help us remember that you are capable of such things time and time again, now and forever. God, we love you. Thank you for loving us in the most perfect way. And it's in your name that we pray. Amen.